Gauteng Premier Panyaza Lesufi says the provincial government and the City of Johannesburg will establish a joint committee which will ensure the implementation of the recommendations of the Khampepe Commission of Inquiry. Now, the inquiry into the Usindiso building fire released its report yesterday following months of hearings. The Commission's findings include the liability of the City of Johannesburg and its entities for the deaths of the 76 mostly foreign residents. The blaze, which ravaged the building in August last year, also led to injuries and displacements. Attorney at Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa, Osmond Mngomezulu, joins us now via video link to weigh in on this report. Thank you so much again for your time. Let's now talk about, just your reaction in terms of this report. You've long been, maintained as theory that the city really cannot look after its buildings, particularly those that have been used as shelters in the city.
Good afternoon, and thank you for inviting us. Indeed, the starting point is that we welcome the report of the Commission, the findings and the recommendations that are contained therein, particularly insofar as they are consistent with the submissions that SERI and the ICF, the Inner City Federation, have made before the Commission. We've made substantive submissions before the Commission relating to the responsibility of the city and its entities, the liability in law of the city and its entities. And in our written submissions, we were the ones to call a spade and say that the City of Johannesburg and JPC had abandoned the building. Because when one thinks about abandoned buildings in the inner city of Johannesburg, they do not think of some of those buildings being abandoned by the city itself, as was the case at Usindiso building.
When you listen to or when you see some of the findings in this report, this report, the recommendations also, the Khampepe Commission says that the City of Johannesburg is liable, as well as the Joburg Property Company. They both must be held to account. How does that look like for you, particularly as you know, with the city, we've had numerous mayors, but in as far as the Joburg Property Company is concerned, we've had stability in terms of its leadership. So how would then this accountability look like, as some are already saying, criminal charges need here to be effected?
Well, the South Africa being a democratic country where there's rule of law, the Commission could not simply say such officials must be dismissed, because those officials must be afforded due process in terms of our labor laws. It is for that reason that the Commission says this is how far we can take it with the limited time we had. We find that the city is responsible and liable for the events of 31 August or the circumstances at Usindiso building. But an independent process must now be undertaken to establish which official and what liability do they bear. But we also take comfort and welcome that Ms. Bottas, the CEO of JPC, has been mentioned by name, meaning there wouldn't be a need to establish who at JPC should be held liable, because we had made submissions even during our cross-examination of Ms. Bottas that she bore responsibility as the accounting officer to ensure the effective protection and use of the assets that are under her control. The Usindiso building is one of the assets that were under her control. But as the Commission correctly points out, she had simply abandoned the building from at least 2019. So at least 4 years before the fire, Ms. Bottas, JPC, and the City of Johannesburg knew about Usindiso building. But other than the raid that took place in in 2019. Nothing else was done thereafter.
And I mean, if you look at the report, I mean, it is quite scathing, against the city. And we're now hearing, from the Premier of Gauteng, Panyaza Lesufi, saying that the provincial government and the City of Johannesburg will establish a joint committee, which will then ensure that the implementations of these recommendations, are adhered to. What for you are critical on this list of recommendations?
Well, the starting point would be the management of these properties, because under JPC, there is a huge portfolio of properties that are owned by the City of Johannesburg. Some of those properties are currently used as temporary emergency accommodation that are offered to occupiers who have been evicted and rendered homeless. So you find that there's dereliction of duty in the management of those properties that become bad buildings, despite the fact that these are properties that are owned by the city, and there is an entity, a municipal entity in the name of JPC that is meant to manage those buildings. But also the issue of basic services is extremely important, because the commission, we welcome the commission finding that the lack of water that followed the disconnection violated or contravened, in fact that's the language that is used, contravened the provisions of the Water Services Act. That's the legislation that was adopted to give effect to the right to have access to sufficient water. Because what you have in this building, as was the case at Usindiso, is that once water is disconnected, the residents then have to fend for themselves and rely on water from the fire hydrants that poses a serious risk to their health, but also it affects also the sanitation, where people now have to rely on buckets to flush their toilets. So perhaps an investigation that looks at the provision of basic services in these buildings, including waste removal, because the commission finds that there was waste that had accumulated with combustible material at Usindiso building. That is the case in some of these buildings in the city of in the inner city, where there is lack of access to basic services, including water, sanitation, electricity, and waste removal. And the residents are left to live in circumstances that are at odds with their right to dignity. So that is another issue that must be visited.
All right. Thank you so much for your time here on the show.